god, so many events are happening today and I don't like it. You're probably like, Boka, don't you like events? And I'm all like, blah. I'd say blah. Blah, 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 blah. Hey guys, look how responsible I was today. Remember when my wish list used to say 180? I cut it down to 120. I'm still trying to get like 2 more, but I saw time was about to start. There we go. Cut it down by 1/3. Now chat, you just need to get me like the first 20. And we can be good at 100. Alright. So we're gonna have a short stream today. Probably. We don't get Slimu today. Slimu has to work. So I don't really have anything to do today. We're just gonna goof off. We're gonna goof off, chat. We're gonna goof off.
If no Slimu and Baka wants to goof off, we could always do horror react instead, lol.
Do you want to do that? Y'all want me to do the horror react? So we're gonna just be watching anime, and we'll probably do a long anime night.
Baka loves Garfield, right?
I like Garfield. Garfield's nice. Oh god, you're not making me watch that scary looking picture of Garfield, are you? You guys need to stop following me. No more giving me money or following me. Or something to me. I can't say I'm a small streamer if you guys keep doing this. I'm a small streamer. Small. Teeny. Insignificant. Streamer. I talk to the ghosts. I don't know why, but it's kind of messed up. The picture. Oh, it's because I'm looking at the screen. Okay. Alright. Let's move it like that. Alright. There we go. Now I can look down and look at you guys. And my model will be getting fixed soon. If you guys want to help out with that, that'd be great. Don't gotta. Alright, yeah, we'll react to this. Alright, you guys like cursed things. Ugh, it looks creepy. Of course it's Super Eyepatch Wolf. Alright. Super Eyepatch Wolf. That made me do scary reacts. Come and watch on twitch.tv/bokathedragon. You would like to also make me do cringe or scary things, I suppose. Alright, here we go.
Garfield is a daily newspaper comic strip starring the iconic orange cat of the same name, as well as his owner, John Arbuckle. Relatable, surly, and adorable, Garfield was based off the childhood memories of his creator, Jim Davis. In the 40 years since we first met this lasagna-loving rascal, Garfield has become a global phenomenon, with yearly merchandising sales at an estimated...
It's by Super Eyepatch Wolf and covered in stuff, so you know it's good. Also volume, please.
I've already turned it up! Is it not loud? Ooh.
Fandoms for a little.
Is it not loud enough? I can look, but it should be fine.
While now, and what I enjoy about doing this is how when you stare at a fandom
If they say it's too loud, Lock-On, I'm throwing things at you. Physically. Mountains.
long enough, you begin to get this very distorted yet very honest reflection of its source material, the heart of The Simpsons, the descent of Sonic, the magnitude of Undertale. But then there's Garfield. Believe me when I say, what Garfield has become on the internet is the most bizarre fandom I have ever encountered. And I'm not even talking about Garfield porn here, although yes, there is totally that as well. And yes, I did have to fuck up my Google Analytics to find these. No, I'm talking about things far more bizarre, which if you are not aware of, allow me to give you a little preview. Alzheimer's Group is a subreddit of 50,000 people reposting the same Garfield comic over and over and over. Each member role-playing like this is the first time they've seen it. Relax John is an 8-part animated series in which a morbidly depressed John Arbuckle is dragged into a frightening alternate reality as he is subsumed by a demonic Garfield. I'm sorry, John. Actually, Jesus, no, we're not ready for I'm sorry, John.
No.
But maybe in like an hour.
I already don't like it.
Maybe you've noticed the runtime for this video and are asking, how could I possibly spend this much time on an idea that the subtle lowering of my father's eyebrows as I explained it to him communicated to me was something he considered a profound waste of time. Oh god, I was meant to make a video about Berserk this year. But I got lost in Garfield. God, I hope it's worth it. But the answer is I have looked deep into Garfield and I have seen things horrible, frightening, and beautiful, including what is to me, and I'm serious here, the greatest piece of fan art ever created. And I would like to show it all to you. So join me on this long and strange journey as we take our first step and ask a question.
I'm gonna need him to stop showing this one right here, please. I don't need that in my dreams.
How the fuck did we get here from a cartoon cat who likes lasagna? Or to put it another way, what is Garfield? So, I want to be honest here.
He's a cat. Why are you wearing the cat outfit? Sidetrack moment, why? I don't understand.
In that, unlike the other fandoms I've covered for this channel, I've never really been that into Garfield.
Why are you holding the tail? What do you mean, why not? I don't know. Don't got words for you,
That's not to say
Cat.
I dislike Garfield. It's just no, I'm not doing this. I do not need to humiliate myself for your amusement. That's not to
That spoke to my soul. That spoke to my soul.
say I dislike Garfield, just that I was never really into him as a kid, and that hadn't changed up until this video. And so my first call was to go look.
I like that it says up until this video. So he doesn't like Garfield anymore. I have a feeling I'm not going to like Garfield anymore. I already don't like some of those pictures. Amuse us? Hell no. Not helping you get your rocks off.
Looking for articles on the appeal of Garfield. But what I found was kind of the opposite. Multiple headlines and videos about how Garfield is not funny and even was never meant to be. How Jim Davis is a marketing man first and the comic was just intended as a vessel to sell merchandise. And after reading a lot of Garfield, and trust me, I read a lot of Garfield.
Okay,
I
buddy.
actually disagree. I think this
Away
is
from
a
the screen.
fairly cynical mischaracterization of Jim Davis and can be traced back to a single quote he gave 40 years ago and is not really reflective of the dude of whom I have watched and read many, many interviews, who is the kind of person who still talks about wanting to make the whole world laugh with a single joke. But if I'm right about this, then why do so many people find Garfield unfunny? And that being the case, how has it survived for 40 years?
Because it is funny.
Very generous with my interpretation.
Not that deep, yo. It is. Garfield is funny. It's just, for whatever reason, it's popular to hate on something that's popular. And I don't understand that mentality. But also at the same time, I know it is the mentality, so I never like give it any room to breathe.
Garfield, but I think it's important to do that because we need to understand the appeal here. And while I am not going to defend the comedy in Garfield, as we shall see later, I find 0.104% of Garfield comics funny. I do think, however, it's worth looking.
You little liar, that's not even like a percent. So to say that means you find none of them funny.
Looking at the reasons why Garfield's humor gets such a polarizing reaction from people.
Unless you count like hit as like 0.1, then you've hit at one comic out of all the ones you read. I've laughed at more than a few of them.
Jim Davis's previous comic before Garfield was Norm the Gnat, which ended in 1975. He then spent 3 years doing, well, nothing before beginning Garfield in 1978. And to give that date a little context, that is not this decade, or the one before that, 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 but the one.
Why you gotta make people feel old?
One before that. Barring the old gods of media like Mickey Mouse and Peanuts, Garfield has been around longer.
Oh, my favorite is Calvin and Hobbes. Somewhere in my room, I have a book of all their comics. Calvin and Hobbes is my favorite.
Than practically any relevant character in pop culture today, and you can imagine this lazy, rude, anti-authority cat being a little more outrageous in the late 70s than he is today. In the same way The Simpsons and Sonic the Hedgehog would have seemed wild and countercultural in their day before it's slowly becoming mainstream, that's exactly what happened to Garfield. We are just not old enough to remember it. And Jim Davis has even talked about this in interviews. That said, I don't think the appeal of Garfield is its humor. I think it's Garfield. And what I mean by this is that we all want to be Garfield. Please don't click off the video, I promise I have a point to make here. Think of everything you consider imperfect about yourself. Physical, mental, emotional, whatever. Any perceived flaw that makes you feel shame. Now, imagine an alternate version of yourself where those flaws still existed, but you just
my most favorite that I looked
them.
for every
You
time
are in
was
perfect
Calvin and
harmony
Hobbes.
with who and what you are, and that's it. And well, that's Garfield. Garfield is lazy.
One of my cousins has a lot of
he's selfish
stuff.
and people
She had a
constantly
plushie
make
that I
fun
tried
of
to
him for being
steal when I
fat.
was young.
But he doesn't give a shit.
We would fight over
is
her
perfectly
plushies.
content in who and what he is, and any of his perceived flaws are other people's problems, not his. And that is some seriously aspirational levels of confidence. But the real genius of the character is he also has all these little traits that allow us to see ourselves in him. Garfield hates Mondays, he likes coffee, he loves lasagna, he dislikes spiders, loves to sleep, and resents authority. These are all very general, but what that means is that no matter who you are, there's probably something in Garfield you're going to be able to relate to. And that relatability, combined with his more aspirational quality, creates this simple but massively appealing cocktail of a character. And I think it's the strength of that appeal that's let Garfield survive for 4.
I feel like it's just people enjoyed the character. I agree with some of it, but I feel like it was really just that it was an appealing character that like resonated with a lot of people, and he had good jokes.
Years. And I just want to note here that for as messed up as
cute.
things are going to
like
get
that
this
version.
video, there is a lot of really cool and wholesome Garfield fan art from people who just earnestly enjoy Garfield's comic and his world. One standout being the fan comic John. which tells the story of an older John Arbuckle rediscovering his love of art and cartooning, and it's just this super cute and endearing take on these characters. Now, granted, you don't have to spend that long looking for Garfield fan art on the internet before things start to get strange, like Garfamon, a blog in which one intrepid Garfield artist has been redrawing the entirety of Pokemon as Garfield, and I don't know how many there are because my browser crashes before I hit Gen 1. But what I think's really interesting about Garfamon is it shows how iconic and malleable Garfield's visual design is. Meaning Garfield's visual design is recognizable enough to be twisted into basically anything and still read
I've seen the couch
Garfield.
before.
This will become horrifyingly relevant later. But it's not just Garfield's character design that applies to, but also the comic itself. Garfield's comic was a big part of his spread, designed to be as simple, timeless, and consumable as possible. Each one is entirely self-contained and rarely, if ever, touches off current events. And since even the early days of the internet and social media, people have been taking these comics and changing them, something that's possible because of how simple a formula they work off, with each comic following the same 3-panel structure. The first panel establishes the scenario. It is the morning and John and Garfield have just woken up. The second panel is the setup. Garfield is in an unusually good mood. And the third panel, the punchline. Garfield is in a good mood because he drinks too much coffee. With the exception of the longer Sunday comics,
yes, thanks. I will have an 11th cup of coffee.
And just like the character himself, that simplicity was...
I want you all to know, don't drink more than 3 in a day. It is very bad for your heart. Depending on the coffee, actually. There are some coffees you could probably drink more of. But, like, why risk it? Like, do you want a heart attack at, like, 20? But, yeah, that's my editor, guys, right there.
Critical in letting as wide an audience as possible understand and enjoy Garfield. But it's also that simplicity that made the comic so infinitely memeable. It is shockingly easy to make your own Garfield comic from splicing together different establishment, setup, and punchline panels. And you can even try this yourself with the random Garfield comic generators. And it's that malleability that's led to scores of popular online trends, such as replacing the last panel of a Garfield comic with an image of Garfield smoking a pipe and a...
That's funny. How could I expose my editor like that? He knows what he does. I don't think it's exposing. This is funny. He's like, do you think everything has a purpose? Absolutely. Garfield! He just goes to smoking a pipe.
An unusual amount of these still work, but my personal favorite is the same, except the final panel now being Garfield being flung from a window.
I mean, that middle one's silly. All of these work so well.
However, in time, people also got much
Alrighty then.
much weirder than that. For example, silent movie Garfield. Garfield with one extra beat panel. Garfish. Garfield with pixel art from that one really bad Garfield game that never released outside Japan. Garfield, but the drawing keeps getting lazier. Multiple choice Garfield. Garfield, except all the comics from 1978 are color averaged together. Real life Garfield.
I don't like that. Where's the pan? Resting not so comfortably?
Uncomfortably close Garfield.
What do you mean uncomfortably close? Oh. No? I don't understand that one.
Garfield evolves into noise. Two Garfields. polarized Garfield, you get the idea. So
I'm
Garfield
starting
is
to
this
understand.
iconic, appealing character communicated through this simple but
My hair
infinitely
is not
consumable
Garfield.
and recreatable
It's fire.
medium. And I think this does go away in helping us understand the existence of something like r/Alzheimer's group. While there is something undeniably cruel about this subreddit, I'd be lying if I said I didn't think there wasn't something interesting and even a little poetic here. The idea that someone's final tether to their own reality is something as simple but recognizable as a Garfield comic strip, and the tragedy of when even that too starts to fade. However, this still doesn't take us any closer to understanding why Garfield on the
Well, that's super creepy.
internet is so, you know. And I think a real easy answer here is it's just the absurdity of making such depraved art out of something so simple and everyday. But as you may be able to tell from the remaining runtime on this video, I disagree. I think there's
You disagree,
genuinely something darker
hour?
and stranger at play here, and I'm not even talking about the official Garfield's very occasional descent into something weirder. I'm talking about a darkness that lies at the heart of every Garfield comic strip. And to start to unravel what that is, I want to talk about the 28th of January 2008, when 27 very strange Garfield-themed videos all simultaneously appeared on a previously unknown YouTube channel. The kind of incredible thing about
I don't like that outfit. I'm gonna be honest.
Lasagna Cat now is how weirdly ahead of its time it was. This was 2008, and the term meme was still years away from becoming something people actually said. And yet, Lasagna Cat made memes of Garfield comics, but then became memes of themselves before you had even finished watching the video. And what I mean by this is that each video of Lasagna Cat is broken into 3 sections. The first is a live-action recreation of a Garfield comic. The second, the actual comic on which the first section was based. And the third, and by far strangest section, would take the footage of section 1 and change it. So this
Yeehaw!
would become this.
Yeehaw!
Music video parodies, video game references, 2008 internet humor. Lasagna Cat was taking Garfield comics and contorting them into all kinds of strange things.
That is weird, like quite weird actually. Yeehaw!
But tantalizingly, underneath the sheer wackiness of it all, there was what felt like a very subtle disdain towards Garfield. There was something a little grotesque and uncanny about these shrunken actors with their sagging costumes and human hands, each skit ending with the same canned, droning laughter that nearly highlighted the mundanity of these jokes.
Garfield, this is a diagram of the food chain. You're here, and that's a mouse down there. Any questions?
Where's pizza?
But the strangest part was how each video ended on a bizarre tribute to Jim Davis. This is one of the first really unusual things I noticed about the Garfield fandom. It has this kind of feverish obsession with Garfield's creator, Jim Davis. And I say unusual because in every other fandom I've covered, I don't know if I remember a single instance of the creator of those properties ever appearing in fanworks, but Garfield is different. Over and over, Davis kept materializing in fanworks, often in very strange ways, and to the best of my knowledge, Lasagna Cat was the first instance of this happening. So, why? Well, if that
So, a very twisted individual.
was a question you asked in
At least in
2008,
my opinion.
you'd be waiting a long time for an answer. After the initial upload day of Lasagna Cat, the channel would go silent. days would become weeks, weeks would become months, and months would become years. And without a single update, Lasagna Cat began to fade into internet obscurity. Which is why it was such a shock when a full 9 years later, a new video appeared on the Lasagna Cat channel, ending with the text, "Telephone Sex Survey, February 9th, 2017.
Hello?
This was the beginning of a strange rabbit hole of videos that led 2 weeks later to a bizarrely high production trailer that claimed if you called a toll-free number and left your name and the number of sexual partners you'd had, a Garfield web series would return. 2 weeks later, and boom. Just like they had 9 years ago, 11 new videos were simultaneously uploaded to Lasagna Cat. And while they were similar in format to the old videos, they were also so different. The first of the new videos begins as any typical Lasagna Cat would, parodying an old comic where Garfield steals John's pipe. But what's waiting for us at the end of the video isn't a re-splicing of the footage from section 1 that we're used to, but a man claiming that this simple Garfield comic transformed his entire existence as he obsessively analyzes every tiny part of the comic in excruciating detail, his examination gradually expanding outward to the immortal nature of art and mimetic culture and its ability to transcend humanity and even
Are you sure he's okay? Does he need someone?
the laws of space and time, and this goes on for an entire hour, and it might just be the best video on the internet. And
Hey, that's saying a lot. If I go watch this video, I better be impressed.
somehow this was just the beginning. Whereas the original end of video skits had that charming amateur with a green screen feel, what waited for us in the third act of these videos now were shockingly high production short films that transformed simple Garfield comics into these elaborate surreal stories. Jokes about Odie getting a bag stuck on his head morphed into these strange tales of the bag-headed Odie becoming a fashion icon before taking his own life and being condemned by Garfield to a hell filled with demonic John Arbuckle chimeras. Gags where John uses the wrong
Hello?
shampoo would now be mutated into, well, this is what they would turn into, and I don't want to describe this. Those simple Garfield jokes were now being contorted to the bizarrest of extremes, contrasting the arguable mundanity of the original with this just wild insanity. And even more pronounced this time was that subtle malice towards Garfield, each video still ending on those bizarre tributes to Jim Davis. But it's only in the final video ever uploaded to the channel that Lasagna Cat would reveal what it truly was. And that video was called Sex Survey Results.
What the frick? It has almost double. It has over double the views of this one. Like, the disconnect there is crazy.
Sex Survey Results begins with John Arbuckle entering his living room and sitting down to read the paper, but he hears a knock on his door and...
Who's there?
To which he answers, revealing a strange white mannequin, the mannequin giving its name and number of sexual partners.
Hey, my name's Garrett Smith, and I have had exactly 0 sex partners.
Before the scene freeze frames and pulls out to reveal a near identical scene, and we begin again, but now with Garfield instead of John. The same events play out, only with a new piece of audio detailing someone else's name and number of sexual partners, and we cycle again, but now with Odie. and then again back to John, and then again and again and again and again and again, and this continues for nearly 5 hours, all of which I have watched, most of which I did live on stream. Watching sex survey results in its entirety is exhausting, an exercise in mind-numbing repetition, but I think there's something
How does it have so many views?
kind of important
The watch analytics for it have got to be terrible.
in that experience. You're listening to all these different recordings of people communicating what is, to many, a pretty sensitive piece of information, and it's weird and even a little uncomfortable. But soon, you just go numb to it. After an hour, it stops feeling weird, and after hours, it stops feeling like anything, because anything repeated enough times loses all meaning. Not unlike a comic strip running day after day after day after day after day for 40 years.
But weren't comics always only in the Sunday paper? I don't understand what they mean by like day after day after day. Oh, so you're saying just put sexy Boka in every single title and I'll do great.
And it's at that point
Yeah,
when
you're
that
crazy.
feeling is at its strongest and you are
Crazy.
completely numb to whatever is happening,
This is why you're
that
kobolds and I'm
Lasagna Cat
dragon.
hits you with what has to be one of the most infamous and shocking pieces of footage that is allowed to exist on YouTube. At this point, the scene has descended into night. The mannequins have begun to take strange and grotesque shapes, and John answers the door one final time, only to be faced with
John Arbuckle, 2. John Arbuckle, 0.
And immediately, this second John ages about 30 years.
What?
This
Gross.
new,
Boka, stop
older
saying
John
such heresy.
Arbuckle, now
Colette will
wandering the
stab.
streets alone, frightened and confused. He finds a dried out husk of a cat, which teleports him to a massive ravine, where he encounters a strange naked shaman who attacks him before teleporting behind him and whispering silent words in his ear, before John collapses into a pile of worms and dirt. The shaman roars, and we hard cut to a young girl screaming in the bathroom of a public school. We're given extreme close-ups of her birthing a stillborn child, and she steps back and stares down in horror before saying something in Polish.
To dziecko nie jest moje. To dziecko jest coś z ciemności. Ja porodziłam ludzkie przekleństwo.
She leaves, and we get one final shot of the child, but now a ginger cat is perched beside it. We cut, the cat is now gone, and the baby opens its eyes before the screen is filled with a block of bright orange.
The hell?
Well, that was a night.
Are we sure he's okay?
Mayor, but I actually think that Lasagna Cat has something really interesting to say. But to get there, we're gonna have to do a little legwork.
I don't like walking. Well, that's a lie. I like walking. I don't like legwork.
Here in this
That's a lie.
video,
I like legwork. I don't know.
we asked, what is Garfield? But
It's a cat! Stop being weird about it.
now, I would like to ask, what is Garfield? Considering I'd had little history with Garfield, I knew to answer this, I would need to immerse myself in him, to understand the comic on an intimate level. And so, I committed to reading 400 Garfield comics. But not just that, I wished to study them. And so, I didn't just read Garfield, I collected data on Garfield. I noted every observation I had in a large Google spreadsheet. And through this, I established that Garfield was made up of roughly 11 different kinds of jokes, such as humor derived from the fact that Garfield is lazy/gluttonous, absurdist humor, relatable humor, other humor, which were either recurring jokes too sporadic for their own category, but mainly jokes about Garfield doing things a cat would do, the joke being that he's a cat, or jokes about Garfield doing things a cat would not do, the joke being he's a cat. These are my least favorite kind of Garfield joke. I measured for a variety of other variables, such as the amount of fourth wall breaks, which was 4, or instances of Garfield becoming suicidal, which was 2, or how many times the comic made me laugh, which was precisely once, and it was this one. After many hours of wall breaks, which was 4, or instances of Garfield becoming suicidal, which was 2, or how many times the comic made me laugh, which was precisely once, and it was this one. After many hours of collecting Garfield data, joke, I measured for a variety of other variables, such as precisely once, and it was this one.
Zip alert, you can't believe Odie. No matter what he says, I did not paint him green. And it wasn't with 2-inch horsehair brush. Here comes the liar now. Well, aren't you going to punish him?
After many hours of collecting Garfield data, I saw
the reason a lot of them didn't make you laugh is because you're trying to look at them all too seriously. You tried to like boil them down to the most serious, like you were like so busy like putting them in a data sheet and all that other stuff that you didn't really have time to appreciate them.
Answer a single question that would surely help me understand Garfield and by extension Lasagna Cat. What was the most common type of joke in Garfield? And when I tabulated the results, what I saw shook me. What was I looking at? This couldn't be possible. And I grew concerned. The 400 comics I had pulled from were a combination of every comic on the Twitter account Random Garfield, which algorithmically pulls 3 random Garfield comics every day, as well as this YouTube video ranking the top 100 Garfield comics.
And like, that has got to be the most like, what's the word? Opinionated video. You don't know what the 100 best ones are.
This video was a mistake. Its author's biases tainted my study, so I proceeded to read 200 more Garfield comics, chosen completely at random from Garfield's web archive. I tallied the numbers again and no, impossible. This time the results were even more pronounced. Was I subconsciously selecting Garfield comics to affirm my own biases? I couldn't allow this. And so I committed to reading an entire year of Garfield, each month being selected from 3 and 4 year intervals across Garfield's 4 decades, bringing my total number of read Garfield comics to 956. But then I was struck with an idea. What if I committed to reading every Garfield comic in existence? Then my data
I don't know
would
if
be
that was
pure,
blockable.
complete, and indisputable. This is when I encountered a problem. When I sought out the estimated total number of Garfield comics in existence, that number was 14,000! But how was there that many? This video was already taking far too long, and at this point, I'd already spent several days reading Garfield comics, and yet somehow I had only consumed 6.83% of all Garfields. For not the last time this video, the very concept of Garfield began to feel gargantuan and impossible, entirely beyond the grasp of my feeble mortal conscience.
has got to stop going existential with some of this stuff. This could not be good for him.
Consciousness, I decided that reading 14,000 Garfield comics was not a realistic goal. I know some of you will consider this a failure. I am sorry.
No, it's fine.
I read up on sample sizes and learned that my current yield of Garfield comics will leave me with a margin of error of about 1.5%, and this is widely considered acceptable. I sigh and proceed forward. I tally the final numbers and rank each strain of Garfield joke from 11 to 1. The results frighten me. I am now going to share this specific breakdown with you because I need you to see what I see. Before we begin, I want you to ask yourself a question. What do you think is the most common type of joke in Garfield?
I feel like it was probably the joke where it's like Garfield's does something a cat wouldn't do. Or something like that.
And I want you to hold on to that guess as we proceed down the list. At number 11, we have jokes centered around Irma, the local cafe owner, and how she's bad at running her business. These jokes make up just 0.42% of Garfield. Just above that, at number 10, with 0.5%, were jokes based around Garfield's girlfriend Arlene. At number 9, with 1%, was humor derived from how much Garfield hates Nermal. At number 8, with 2.3%, is comedy conveying Garfield's hatred of spiders. At number 7, with 4.5%, was relatable humor. This was the first major surprise to me. I had assumed that a cat whose entire branding was built on one simple, relatable quote would have more relatable humor in its comic. I was wrong, and it wouldn't be the last time. At number 6, at 4.7%, was whimsy derived from Garfield's abuse of Odie. At number 5, with 13.7%, was mildly surreal and absurdist humor. At number 4, with 16.8%, are jokes based on Garfield being lazy or gluttonous, and again, for obvious reasons, I was shocked not to see this further up the list. At number 3, with 17.4%, is other. These are the kinds of jokes I do not like. And at number 2, with 18.8%, is a mystery category that I will reveal much later in the video for dramatic effect. Now, before I unveil number 1, I want to stop and ask you again, what do you think is the most common
Garfield
type
doing
of
things
joke in Garfield?
cats don't do.
At number 1, and by far the biggest shock on the list, was a category I never even would have guessed existed, and it's called John is pathetic. John Arbuckle is 30 years old. He lives alone, has no real friends outside his dog and cat, and is constantly lonely. And these are all things that the Garfield comic takes joy in ridiculing. A typical John is pathetic gag works like this. John says he's not going to call women for dates anymore, that he's going to wait for them to approach him. We see him waiting, and then we see him waiting what appears to be several months later. Jokes like this are very common, not just in how women find John actively repulsive, but in how he is pathetic and should be ridiculed. And you can see this in how the comic portrays his intelligence, his hobbies, his fashion sense, to even his physical strength and inadequacy in anything that could be considered remotely masculine. Across nearly 1,000 comics, I measured 0 cases of John showing any admirable qualities. Meaning, whereas Garfield is something to be aspired to, John is something to be laughed at.
I mean, not a lot. That's not that deep. It's literally just. Oh, thank you for the keys. It's literally just. People like to look to other things to aspire to. And since it's by this guy, it's based on himself. He's not gonna put a lot of good qualities on himself, because a lot of people don't. You need to really love yourself, but a lot of people don't do that enough. They only see the negative qualities they have.
Even when John did find a girlfriend in Liz 28 years into Garfield's run, and only after fans begged Jim Davis to end John's loneliness, he's still treated as this pathetic character. And I think there's something kind of sad about that. A person whose only purpose is to be ridiculed and to be trapped in that existence for 40 years. And where this gets even sadder is when you start to consider the comic from John's perspective. Across that same range of comics, I measured 156 instances of John displaying some kind of negative emotion or mental anguish, anger, depression, lethargy. But if you're
all humans have it, I feel like it's more of just. I feel like the commonality here is that it wants to focus mostly on Garfield. So every now and then it'll put a lot of these in there. John's a sad state of being, so that it puts more focus on Garfield. Less people want to focus on John.
For a casual reader of the comics, it might never feel like that, as whenever John does begin to sink into despair, Garfield is there to deliver a witty punchline and diffuse the tension. But here is where we start to get into the very strange nature of reality and Garfield. See, as the audience, as the readers of this comic, we can experience Garfield's thoughts through the visual device of thought bubbles. But critically, this is not the case for John. Across every Garfield comic I read, I didn't record a single instance of John ever directly reacting to Garfield's thoughts in a way that couldn't be explained by him intuiting Garfield's body language and expression. And that information is critical because it means the reality we are experiencing and the one John is experiencing are entirely different. And this brings us to a question. What is it really like being John Arbuckle? On the 13th of February 2008, a Garfield fan comic was uploaded to Tumblr, and it looked just like a regular Garfield comic, but with one critical difference. The first panel depicted John sitting alone with the dialogue, "I've done things in my life that I regret." The second panel shows nothing, just John, his remorseful silence unbroken. The final panel of the comic punctuated by nothing, just a slight shift in John's expression, like his regrets are washing over him. What this was just a regular Garfield strip with one key difference. Garfield had been removed, and because of the very specific way John and Garfield communicate, the comic still works. But whereas before Garfield's punchlines could distract us from John's misery, that's no longer the case. And this was the beginning of the bizarre and morbid webcomic Garfield minus Garfield, which lets us experience the true crushing reality of John. And some of these comics are...
Oh, that's gotta be a... Well, I want to... Sometimes I want to think about what's in the mind of these people that like to pick out like the more morbid side of things. But then I think about it further and I'm like, oh no, I don't want to be in that mind. If this is what they find enjoyment in.
Really haunting. There's one in particular...
Good on ya. You have fun with that as long as it makes you happy.
That is either very hopeful or very devastating, depending on your perspective, where John says, "We can't do anything about the past, but we can do something about the future," before he just disappears. Garfield minus Garfield was not the first instance of people removing Garfield from the comic to produce this kind of effect, but it was what popularized the idea online that there may be something very wrong with John Arbuckle. And over time, other fan works began to explore this in similar ways. Realistic Garfield, for example, conveyed similar themes by just replacing Garfield with a realistic cat who could not talk, as did fan comics like Arbuckle, while animations like Meat Canyon's Lasagna brought the idea of John's fractured reality even further, depicting John as a frightening, delusional lunatic who holds his terrified victims captive and forces them to play the part of Garfield and Odie, as he warps back and forth between the John Arbuckle we know from the comics and something much, much darker. The reason all these pieces are important is that they show not only that there is something kinda wrong with John
Canyon always
Arbuckle,
makes things scary.
but also that is something that even in the early days of Garfield's online fandom, people picked up on. But where things get even stranger is when we look at this through the lens of what John Arbuckle was originally meant to be. Remember earlier when I said that Norm Nat ended in 1975, Jim Davis then spent 3 years doing nothing, and Garfield started in 1970?
I've seen a few of these. They're kind of funny.
Well, that was a lie, but I framed it this way because for decades, that's what people thought was the truth. Listen to any interview in which Jim Davis speaks about the origins of Garfield, and he'll wheel out the same anecdote about the failure of Norm Nat because insects are not appealing characters.
They're not. Like, that was like the first... That's like the first thing you would realize when you try to start making a comic. You want your characters to be appealing.
And how that realization led to him looking at dog-centric comics like Peanuts and Marmaduke and saying to himself, what if I can create a similar character but for people who like cats? And thus, Garfield was born. Except this version of events also ignores the existence of Heathcliff, another surly, round, orange cat who predates Garfield by about 5 years, and this isn't relevant at all, but I just think it's funny. However, this telling is a lie, or at least not the full truth. Because you see, in the period between 1975 and 1978, there was a third comic, one that was only discovered in 2019 by intrepid Garfield historian Quentin Reviews, and this comic was simply titled John. There are two very strange things about John. The first being how closely it resembles Garfield. Everything from jokes to entire layouts are repeated across the two series, the only difference being that the main character here is John. Davis has spoken a lot about how John Arbuckle is an analog for him. Both grew up on a farm, both live in Muncie, Indiana, and both are cartoonists. In fact, Davis originally wanted to use the character of John as a way to voice his frustration with the comic strip industry, which, if you look at where Davis was in his life when he first started writing this character, that tracks. John started just 2 weeks after the failure of Norm Nat, and you can feel that frustration in these early comics. In one instance, John even turning to the camera and saying how he thinks the content of this comic will land him in trouble with parents groups. And while Garfield still featured heavily, there were strips where he just didn't appear at all, with scenarios more focused on observational humor derived from the perspective of a single man. But it wasn't long into the run when that started to change, with jokes more and more centering around Garfield and not John.
Basically, I can already see where it's basically Jim started really liking Garfield. He liked his creation. He started to feel like that sense of hilarity from it.
The final strip of John being published on August 8th, 1977, the strip returning a week later, but now named Garfield. And within a year, Garfield would be syndicated on a national level, becoming the newer version of the comic we are all now familiar with. The second thing I find so strange about John is that while Jim Davis is often happy to laugh about the failure of Norm Nat, he barely ever speaks about John, and when he does, he only talks about it in the vaguest of terms, as if it was an idea in his sketchbook as opposed to an actual published comic. And I can't help but wonder
Which to him it probably is, because what I'm guessing basically what John was for him was him just throwing ideas at a wall constantly, and in that, like, getting out his frustrations and stuff. But in that frustration, he noticed something bright, and that was Garfield, and that is why he focused more on Garfield, because he was like, that's the good in this comic. I want to bring out the good in this comic. I don't want to look at the negativity anymore. I don't want to, what's the word, like, focus on it.
there's something to that. If the idea of a comic that was meant to be his own perspective, his own outlet on life, was a failure, overtaken by a fictional character he created. Even stranger, as Garfield went on, the similarities between Jim Davis and John Arbuckle began to disappear. John's job as a cartoonist practically vanishing as he devolves into the pathetic shell of a man we now know. And I'm not saying here that I think Jim Davis has some deep-rooted trauma that is manifesting in his daily newspaper comic. I
don't even think it's that. I think it's that, like I said, I think he really wanted to focus less on the negativity. Like, he kept that negativity there because he knew that it was there, and he wanted, like, people, because he wanted it to be kind of, I guess, like, relatable to people, because a lot of people have negativity in their lives. John is that negativity, but he brings Garfield in there as there could be hilarity, there could be happiness. I think the Garfield comic is more about bringing your spirits up. Garfield's there to give you the brighter side of things.
I only do not think that, but I do think that this perspective adds a lot to this strange meta-narrative of a man overtaken by his own creation, abandoning the character he once embodied, and that character now being trapped in a life of existential suffering.
Thank you.
And here's
Welcome
the
from
thing.
YouTube.
If I was the only person who saw this, then there wouldn't be a story here. But I'm not. Let's go back to those last 5 minutes of Lasagna Cat. Lasagna Cat ended 2 years before the discovery of John, but even then, what John adds to Lasagna Cat is kind of chilling. Like in that final scene, when that second John ages, he begins to bear a striking resemblance to Jim Davis, the person we now know John was originally meant to be. This new strange combination of Jim Davis and John Arbuckle, lost and clinging to the husk of a cat he should have let go of a long time ago, before he comes face to face with a version of Garfield that's become independent from him and is now strange and frightening, before Davis crumbles to earth, outlived by the very thing he created, which is immediately followed by the bathroom scene. And what's interesting here is that if we translate the girl's monologue from Polish, it reads, "This child isn't mine. This child is from the darkness. I've given birth to humanity's curse. My soul will be swallowed and vomited and swallowed again, forever. Sick joke, but no one is laughing. My blood will remain. Death isn't the end. I am in hell. This is hell." And while I can't show it on screen, in that final shot, the baby is shown wearing a blue shirt identical to John Arbuckle's. For pieces of art like this, I think there is a lot of different interpretations that you can make. But for me personally, when Lasagna Cat is taken in totality, it becomes this bizarre statement on what happens when the things you create become more powerful than you. How Garfield has become this semi-immortal entity, evolving past both John Arbuckle and Jim Davis. And I mean this literally. Garfield is no longer even created by just Jim Davis. He has an entire team of people working under him who have become so adept at creating Garfield, their work is now indistinguishable from his. And Davis has even spoken about selecting a replacement so that Garfield can continue long after he's gone. But here's the thing. It's not just Jim Davis's reality that Garfield has had this strange effect on. It's also ours. That might sound weird. I mean, how relevant could Garfield actually be in the modern era? Well, if I was to ask you...
It's a very, like, appealing character that was really funny, that got a lot of people happy and stuff. And it was... I feel like it's only obvious that it's going to become like one of these. My brain can't come up with the word right now, but basically it makes sense that it would get a lot of...
Which character out of Superman, Goku, and Garfield was the most syndicated? Which would you pick? And if you...
It would probably be Garfield, because one, Superman is a niche of comic books. And then Goku is a niche within a niche. And he's in a different country. And he was just recently... He just... had just started to come over to America. So I definitely wouldn't put Goku up there. The only one that would have even chance is Superman. And even then, he's in a niche. There wasn't really movies of Superman. There was like I think one or two. But movies weren't even that popular yet.
Picked any answer other than Garfield, well, that was a strange choice given the subject of this video, but...
Yeah, that and the video is based on Garfield, so why wouldn't it be Garfield? But yeah, like, Goku just started coming over to America. Superman, a niche within a niche. Comic books, and then he's specifically Superman comic books. Like, serialization there wouldn't even compete with something that was a comic book strip on the newspaper. Everyone got the newspaper back then. Like, what did you expect? If you were gonna, like, guess these.
Yeah, it is Garfield.
Yeah, serialization is basically how widely distributed and stuff.
Multiple decades in thousands of worldwide newspapers, Garfield has an estimated audience in the hundreds of millions.
Yeah, like, he was in the newspaper. Of course he'd be the most serialized.
The New York...
What people probably don't understand today, newspapers were everywhere. There was little jobs for the newspaper, like newspaper boy. Like, I used to go out in the mornings to get the newspaper for Papa. Because I got excited to do that. I was kind of sad when that stopped appearing. But really, it got to the point where we only cared about Sundays. Because comics.
Times had to change how its trade bestseller list was categorized after 7 of its 10 slots were occupied by Garfield. And today, his merchandising sales are at an estimated $800 million to $1 billion, and that is a lot to...
I would love to have one of those giant Garfields.
Sell in 40 years. Oh, wait, that's every year? That's every fucking year! In products that twist Garfield into every conceivable form you can imagine. For example, Garfield soap, Garfield air fresheners, Garfield cushions, Garfield teapots, a poster with Garfield as a ninja, Garfield headphone holders, Garfield thermostat, Garfield commemorative coin, Garfield digital alarm clock, Garfield's key hanger, Garfield piggy bank, Garfield Walkman, Garfield Globe, Garfield Ice Skates, Garfield Boxing Gloves, How to Insult Your Friends, Garfield Book, Garfield Web Browser, Garfield Amusement Park Ride, Garfield Personal Massager, a Garfield mug, another Garfield mug, a much dumber Garfield mug, a Garfield mug that is even dumber than the first dumb Garfield mug, Existential Garfield, another Existential Garfield, Slightly Too Many Irish Stereotype Garfield, Garfield
Kind of insulting.
waistcoat, Unwell Garfield, Garfield Gun, Satan Garfield, Slime Garfield, Child Garfield, Illegal Garfield, another fucking Garfield mug. I don't know what this is. Table Garfield, yet another Table Garfield. Garfield Prison Tray.
I don't know who's getting that last one right there.
Sex Garfield. Far too large Garfield. Nightmare Garfield. This horrifying bedsheet. The deeply cursed Garfield eats. What is this? Why? This Garfield jigsaw, which for some reason I can't quite pin down, puts the fear of God in me. In the mid-80s, a small coastal French village began to suffer an unusual phenomenon when plastic Garfield phones began washing up on shore. No one knew where they came from or why this was happening, but it continued for 3 decades, a mystery that was only solved in 2019 when the mysterious phones were traced back to a lost shipping container. We have so saturated this planet with Garfield merchandise that even the Earth herself has begun to reject it. But if that's the case, why
That's a funny way of looking at it.
don't we notice Garfield more? Why don't we see him everywhere in every day? And the answer is because they don't want us to. In the early 1980s, a production accident led to a Garfield plush with suction cups attached to its hands and feet. Paws Inc., the holding company for Garfield, didn't expect what was a botched product to sell well, which is why it was such a shock when the toy was so popular, it led to a wave of car break-ins where radios and purses were left behind and only the plush was stolen.
But I was about to say, no way did people go out of their way to steal it. And then, yep.
Sales climbing to a staggering $50 million. And what did Jim Davis and Paws Inc. do? We pulled all plush dolls off the shelves for 5 years. They didn't want Garfield to be a fad. They wanted to silently inject him into every part of our daily lives, where he could hide in plain sight, silently growing into one of the most dominant fictional characters on the planet. And here's
Which I don't think that'll ever happen.
they succeeded. What I'm about to tell you is not a joke. This is not some Space Jam 2.
He's more like a creepypasta.
This all happened
thing if
over the course
this video
of
is to
making
be
this video.
assumed.
An experience I call the Garfield phenomenon. It began in small ways. At first, I'd be watching a TV show and, oh, hey, there was Garfield. I'd look at Instagram and, my friends were posting about Garfield and, oh, a text. I guess Chris Pratt is playing Garfield in the new Garfield movie.
Of course they're going to make a movie about him. They're making
strange
movies of all the mascots.
timing. Wait, why is Toby Fox talking about Garfield? And sexy goth Garfield began trending on Twitter?
All right, look at the boobs, chat. Get your boob look-ins. Or boob looks. I don't know how to phrase that, but yeah. Can you unsee this? I don't think so, no. But this is literally what happens to all, like, popular characters, or does no one remember freaking Bowsette?
I began to feel slightly uneasy, so maybe I'll just try and relax
The Garfield booze in Fear and Hunger? What?
and look at some gaming news and oh, hey! I guess Garfield's the new character in that Smash Nickelodeon fighting game. Isn't that
Which obviously that would happen.
grand? I'd been watching ReZero, which I did not like very much, and someone told me that Garfield appears in the 2nd season, which just can't be true, and what the fuck? A friend sent me a
It's
picture
a tiger. Garfield is not every tiger in every show.
of a mural in an old house, and there was Garfield.
It's an old mural of all the old characters. Stop being existential about this.
Staring at me with what I can only describe as some kind of all-knowing contempt.
I'm worrying about the man.
I was now doing whatever I could not to think about Garfield, and I agreed to watch the first episode of the new Dexter with my partner, and
Wow, yeah, I can only imagine. but I wanted to call him Garfield. I mean, who needs a dog?
What the fuck? What the fuck did he just say?
Calm down, calm down.
Everywhere I looked,
I'm hurt right now. I'm like, calm down. Calm down. Not that serious.
I saw Garfield. But why? Why was this happening now? Well, that answer would come to me.
It's an orange shirt or an orange... Man needs a break.
It did so.
Like, if you focus on something too much, you're gonna start seeing it everywhere, okay?
In
That's
the
just
form of a
how the
phone
human
call.
mind works.
Hello.
Hi, son.
Oh, hey, ma'am. How's it going?
John, I know you're working on your video of Garfield at the moment, so guess what? I found the picture of you with your Garfield.
Oh, ma'am, I don't think that was me. I was never actually that into Garfield. So, earlier in this video, when I said that...
You better not be that... obsessed with me. I'll start
I
putting
was
walls
never
up.
into Garfield, that was true. I don't remember this. I don't remember owning this massive Garfield doll, but that is me, and that is my mom, and this happened. I just don't...
I'm trying to think if I ever had really anything Garfield. I do remember that my cousin used to own a... I don't know if she still does, but she had a Garfield plush that she kept in the front of her car, in the back of her car. As like, because she was a college student, so... Garfield plush in the back, Hogar plush in the front. What I wanted was Hogar. When I got to start sitting in the front seat, I found out about Hogar and I wanted Hogar. Other than that, I don't think there was really anything Garfield that we had. I'm trying to think. Not that I can think of.
remember. And this is when it started
I was more interested in Pokemon.
to click. That when you look for Garfield, you begin to find him everywhere. Even in the past. This is the Garfield phenomenon. Garfield is all around us, and he always has been. We just never noticed. But my eyes are open, and now, so are yours. If an alien race dug through a ruined Earth, they would think we worshipped Garfield. And they would be right.
No.
These are the 3 keys in unlocking what Garfield has become on the internet. A daily newspaper comic strip designed to be as simple and consumable as possible, but because of this becomes unintentionally malleable and recreatable, spreading edits of it online, one of which unknowingly touches off a bizarre meta-narrative of a man being overtaken by his own creation. That creation in time becoming an entity unto itself, one that has laid just outside the perception of man for 40 years and will remain there for infinitely more, transcending.
Joke's on you, I'm below my bed right now. I have a, what I like to call a sky bed.
Humanity itself. This is the bizarre modern reality of Garfield. And now that we understand it, we may enter the world of I'm Sorry, John. On
I'm
October
not looking forward to
22nd,
this.
2013, a comic was uploaded to the internet that showed John.
I'm gonna pause this real quick so I can go to the bathroom. I don't want to pee myself. Alright. Here we go.
Arbuckle awaking late one night.
Garfield will be in
But
the
something is
bathroom. Shut
wrong.
up.
Something is very wrong. His room is bathed in an eerie orange glow, a strange
I'm sorry,
material
John.
covering his walls, his furniture, and his entire home.
Hello?
He goes downstairs to try and discover the source of this problem, and upon entering the kitchen, he sees Garfield, his cat's strange swollen head bizarrely embedded in the wall, his skin spreading outward, covering every surface of his home.
I was so hungry.
As John realizes with horror, his entire home with him in it have been ingested by Garfield.
I'm sorry, John.
This was the beginning, and in the years to follow, more and more strange and frightening depictions of Garfield
The creepiness,
would
got it.
begin to appear on the internet. Comics that looked normal at first, only to take disturbing turns, with Garfield often portrayed as something alien and unknowable, one of the most popular of which was 2017's Gramfell, a darkly humorous webcomic whose early pages were focused on John's depression, met by an uncaring, nihilistic Gramfell. But as the comic continued, Gramfell began to reveal to John not only the inherent unhappiness of life, but the futility of his existence as a character trapped in a webcomic, breaking John down to his core components and trapping him in strange and surreal realities over and over, at one point even transforming the very webcomic of Gramfell itself into a different series called Jan and Gram, in which John gets to live out the cute and peaceful life he's always wanted before John is ripped from his serene dream and in the final page is forced to acknowledge that he is alone, and he always will be. What I find so fascinating about Gramfell is it's that same dynamic of John and Garfield, just brought to a cosmically nihilistic extreme. This was the core concept of what would inform everything that was to come, but notably Gramfell never felt truly frightening or disturbing because of the simple pastel cuteness of its aesthetic. And if the horror of Garfield on the internet was going to truly solidify, it needed an aesthetic, and in the following year, it would get it. In 2018, an image would be uploaded to Instagram from horror artist Will Burke, one that depicted a horrifyingly bloated Garfield clutching a tiny, frightened John with the text,
John, I require lasagna.
Something about this
Why you
image
gotta say it in the
resonated
creepy
with
filtered
people, and
voice?
it became wildly popular online, becoming the
Please,
first in a
not Garfield.
series of 5
You guys are-
illustrations, each one depicting Garfield as a grotesque, swollen monstrosity, his form
You guys are unhinged.
swimming between heaving mounds of flesh and sharp insect-like appendages as he hunted John through his home. And while the sheer horror of seeing Garfield twisted into such nightmarish forms were a huge part of the power of these images, critically, they also captured the kind of hopelessness of the character of John Arbuckle, but channeled it into pure horror. One illustration showing John terrified and clutching a shotgun as a grotesque centipede-like Garfield emerges through the door behind him, with text that reads,
Bullets don't work, John.
the final image of this series depicting a gargantuan Garfield now towering over a helpless, terrified John as he whispers,
The world is going to end, John.
What
These
the
images
heckles?
would rampage across the internet, being posted, reposted, and upvoted tens of thousands of times, and would become the blueprint for everything Garfield would become online. As different artists began to create their own interpretations of Burke's work, such as animator Lumpy Touch, who took Burke's illustrations and reimagined them through stunning and horrifying pixel art animations, not only giving these still images a new horrifying dimension through movements, but also reframing them as a 2D survival horror video game. Lumpy Touch taking this concept even further later on, with both a first-person exploration recreation of the original I'm Sorry John comic, as well as creating a tutorial for his own fake Garfield survival horror game in which the player is hunted by one of 13 Gorefields, all based on the different zodiac signs. And what I really love about this is you can see that kind of existential horror introduced by Gramfell, as well as the more grotesque body horror introduced by Burke, now being spliced with other mediums and genres of horror, and you could see this continue to evolve in other illustrations like those of artist Omega Black, who took the idea of Garfield horror and introduced a cosmic eldritch feel, like this image in which Garfield states,
"I no longer require eyes, John."
which I am pretty sure is a reference to the 1997 film Event Horizon, a sci-fi horror in which a group of astronauts board a lost starship that has returned from hell, featuring the infamous line,
"Where we're going, we won't need eyes to see."
Omega Black's other illustrations only expanding on this Lovecraftian style of Garfield horror, with a grotesque centipede-like Garfield stating,
"Heaven is a void of light, John."
Or John being held captive by cloaked Odies before an impossibly massive multi-armed Garfield booms,
"I'm eternal, John."
Each new piece of Garfield's fan art added to this idea of Garfield as a cosmic, horrifying being, sometimes referred to as Creepy Garfield or Gorefield. And this is what led to October 8th, 2018, and the creation of the subreddit r/I'm Sorry John. There's nearly a cult-like feel to I'm Sorry John. Its title plaque reading, "Garfield has abandoned his limited form and he is beautiful. Surrender yourself to him and be saved." This is a community of nearly 800,000 people dedicated to bringing to life this new version of Garfield the internet has created, as well as his infinite torment of John Arbuckle. And maybe, like I did, you're thinking, no, Garfield's not evil, he's not trying to hurt John. It's not like that mystery number 2 category of Garfield joke is in fact humor based off Garfield's torment of John. But that's right, at 18.8%, nearly 1 in 5 Garfield jokes center around Garfield causing John mental anguish. And it's not just that. Another variable I measured for was the amount of times Garfield showed empathy towards John or tried to comfort his suffering in any way. And across nearly 1,000 comics, that number was 0.
No, there are times
where
he literally looks at John and says something nice.
Real, if unintentional, about Garfield. The same is true in I'm Sorry John. Garfield has always been about a person trapped with a cold, nihilistic being that torments him, and it's been that way for 40 years. And all that r/I'm Sorry John does is bring that concept to a horrifying extreme. This is the reason I think so many pieces on I'm Sorry John have this odd kind of power to them. Their horror is rooted in being trapped with something awful and inescapable. But what's really fascinating about the horror of I'm Sorry John is how different artists have approached this idea in different ways.
Diabolical.
I like categorizing things, so I've identified what I think are 3 basic kinds of horror on I'm Sorry John. The first being physical Garfield horror. These are pieces that twist Garfield into strange and frightening creatures, sometimes into amalgamations of unsettling body horror, but more often swelling Garfield to such nightmarish proportions that there is no chance of John ever defeating, escaping, or even surviving these grotesque beasts Garfield has become. And what's interesting here is how many of these pieces evoke or even directly reference the FromSoft games Dark Souls and Bloodborne, which themselves create a lot of their horror and emotion by forcing you into battles with these massive and horrifying creatures that feel impossible to overcome. It's that kind of physical hopelessness that these pieces create. And just like those games, the more extreme examples of this kind of Garfield horror carry a cosmic, nearly Lovecraftian feel, as Garfield is now so large, so impossible, that he begins to feel like some kind of terrible deity, a being of such immense power and scale.
I think it's hilarious how he pronounces deity. He says deity. It's cute. Although I feel like I understand the concept of the creepy, scary Garfield. If you make something too wholesome and too relatable and stuff, there are some people that just really like horror. And a subsection of those will get intrigued by Garfield and start making art. And there you go.
That it throws into chaos our own sense
Garfield
of humanity's place in the universe. Whether we really are the dominant species we've always assumed, or just dust in the wake of something much greater. I just read that line and I can't believe we're talking about fucking Garfield. The second type of Garfield horror is more intimate and psychological. Here, it's less that Garfield is a physical threat as much as it is the subtle, insidious damage he's doing to John's mental state, sometimes in the form of an awful, malicious creature who constantly follows John and goads him, driving him to do terrible things, but sometimes as a delusional presence in John's own mind, a manifestation of his internal struggles, be they depression, addiction, or worse, in a way that feels similar to your Shinings, your Silent Hills, or reading your own comment section. These pieces are much rarer, but what I think's awesome about them is how they take that bleakness that's always been a part of John's character and express it through Garfield. There is a third type of Garfield horror, and these are my personal favorite. Posts that focus on a more existential form of terror. The simplest examples of this are pieces that trap John in these impossible and infinite liminal spaces where there is no escape and he will forever be haunted by Garfield. But other scenarios are more elaborate, like when even death itself can't release John from Garfield's grasp, showing Garfield as this immortal, unending being who will always return to plague John, or even the opposite, like in this one comic where John takes his own life to escape Garfield, only to be brought back to life by him so his suffering can continue. Other pieces are stranger and even more abstract, like showing Garfield as these grotesque physical parasites that have attached themselves to John and are feeding off him, while he is trapped in these strange, unending dream worlds. And I think where this particular kind of horror gets really powerful is when it's combined with the more psychological type of Garfield horror we just talked about, like Lumpy Touch's Relax John, which we mentioned earlier. And what I think is so...
I think it's very, like, amazing, like, how well some of this art is made, though. Like, it definitely shows a lot of passion.
Great about this animation is it shows John returning home late one night at his most broken, his life now destroyed, having lost his job, Liz, and even Odie. And it's at this point, when he's at his absolute lowest, that he is most vulnerable to a being like Garfield, who offers John an escape from his miserable existence in the form of comfort, but in reality drags him into a frightening nightmare. And I love this so much because it is such a fantastic example of what Garfield has become on the internet. Garfield is despair. He's the part of John that makes him feel weak and insignificant, who pulls him down and traps traps him in realities dark and frightening. That is the core horror of Garfield and I'm Sorry, John. It's interesting to note that this concept has only continued to evolve online, in sub-communities like You're Welcome, John, which is a more wholesome, if still very disturbing, relationship between John and a cosmically nightmarish Garfield, as well as I'm Really Sorry, John, which I cannot even talk about if this video has any hope of staying monetized. Hey.
Don't even ask.
By the way,
I already hear you asking.
This video
don't
is nearly
ask.
definitely going to be demonetized, and so I have
Yes, it will.
a Patreon. There's one tier, it's $1. So yeah, but hey, look, either way, I appreciate you watching. You can even see this very defined kind of Garfield horror being transplanted onto other fictional series with I'm Sorry John's occasional non-Garfield weekends. And while I really love these pieces,
Ernie, how do I look? With your eyes, Bert. With your eyes.
God, that's so good. I think it's interesting how, at least to me, they never quite carry the same level of impact.
To give you an idea, Peppa Pig is the one that scares me. Because the art itself is kind of cursed if you think about it in realism
on Garfield.
ways.
Not only because of how deeply rooted the horror of I'm Sorry, John is in the very core of Garfield, but also in how, when taken with everything else we've talked about today, these pieces begin to transform what these characters are, and in particular, John Arbuckle.
I have no answers.
When I started this video, all John was this schlubby dude, but over time,
Garfield
that
meets,
started to change.
Dark Souls?
I watched him go from this character with a very defined purpose and reason for
like
existing
Garfield meets
to someone
Bloodborne.
who loses that purpose
Eldritch.
and becomes to the world around them a pathetic joke. And it's like that experience causes this deep emptiness to well up inside them, a despair that makes life feel meaningless and impossible in a way that the Garfield comic can barely contain, till one day that despair begins to manifest as Garfield, an entity that traps John in this deep and horrifying delusion, warping every part of his reality. This entity, with each passing day, growing stronger and more frightening as John falls deeper into despair. And when I think of this late stage of John's existence, there's one artist in particular that comes to mind. Part of what makes Rojam's work so powerful and frightening is how intimately they seem to understand each particular kind of Garfield horror. Some pieces show Garfield as these massive, monstrous beasts whose mere existence conveys this horrifying physical futility. Others show Garfield as this gargantuan and grotesque parasite, as this insidious force that's been with John since the moment he was born, and for years has manipulated and contorted every part of his life, draining John, until finally, Garfield has grown so powerful that he's now more a god than anything else, so infinite, cosmic, and terrifying that he's become John's entire reality.
I gotta say, the animation messes with me a little bit.
Now just a speck of dust, hopeless and terrified in the face of this thing that he created till the end of time. And I think there's something really powerful about these images. The beautiful thing about horror is it lets us externalize the things that haunt us. And when I look at the work of Omega Black or Lumpy Touch or Rajam, what I see is a person struggling. Someone whose existence stopped making sense a long time ago and who's just trapped in this horrifying distortion of what their life should be. And I think there's something very human about that. When I think back to the very worst periods of my life, what comes to me is this feeling of being trapped in my own.
Oh my god, he's in the outfit again.
There is something in me that is distorting how I see the world and the people around me and everything, and it's horrible. It's a nightmare. And I think the hardest part of it is the feeling that it's never going to end, that the way you feel in those moments is how you will feel for the rest of your life. And if you've ever struggled mentally or emotionally, you know that fear. And it is that fear that I've never seen visualized better than in fucking Garfield.
What's hilarious about him talking about the fear and stuff is that's literally just someone drew Meowth as Garfield.
Fan art. We all want
like all the other stuff's
to be
scary-ish and creepy. Then there's Meowth over here.
But we all are John.
Yeah, I love how
Arbuckle.
like detailed it is.
And the thing is, those bad times, they do never last. They do end. And I think that's why I find this final piece so hopeful. The piece is done in Rajam's traditional pen and ink style, but with a subtlety that makes it feel nearly carved from stone. And it shows a demonic Garfield lying, defeated and broken, a sandaled foot pinning him to the ground, which belongs to an angelic John Arbuckle. Tears rolling down his face, his wings raised in this just glorious art.
That is amazing.
And it's like, after everything we've watched John go through, after all the loneliness, the depression, the complete loss of his identity, leading to the dissolution of his reality into this infinite, abject nightmare, after all that, somehow he's made it.
Little kitty
to
go
this moment.
Meow.
He's taken his life back from the shit that haunts him, and it's fucking beautiful. And maybe this won't last. Maybe there's still darker times ahead. But it doesn't matter. Because in this moment, he's okay. John's okay. And look, I get it. I get that having this strong an emotional reaction to what is most certainly a Garfield shitpost is ridiculous.
I don't know if you can call it a shitpost when there's this much passion in it, though.
But goddamn, that is what I do here.
Yeah.
I take my hope where I can get it. The title of this piece being The Forgiveness of John. Oh, I put the
Becca, I'm hungry.
I put the
Got any
costume
food in your
back on
fridge?
because I was worried that this part might be too heavy without it, and
I mean, maybe, but
and also I paid a lot of money for it. What makes
I bet those typically are very expensive.
The Forgiveness of John so powerful to me is that in isolation it is an amazing piece of art and a real technical achievement, but when taken with everything else we've spoken about this video, It becomes the concluding chapter of a gigantic meta-narrative that is formed around John Arbuckle. And again, if I was the only person who saw that, there wouldn't be a story here. The forgiveness of John being the third most popular post on r/I'm sorry John of all time, as well as adorning its front page. And I think it's awesome that so many people's individual works come together to pull such an incredible story out of something as simple as a daily comic strip about a cat who likes lasagna. This is what I love about fandoms. When you stare at them for long enough, these beautiful and strange stories start to emerge that are distorted and honest and amazing. And whatever else you want to say about the nightmare of the modern day internet and social media, I'm glad that those stories have a place to exist. I think that's pretty cool.
Alright guys, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. But, good gosh. Good gosh. Oh my gosh.